Welcome, everyone, to another edition of the Irish Breakdown Podcast. I'm Vince D'Addario. That's Brian Driscoll. And we got another fun one for you, folks. It is a Thursday. We are inching ever so close to the beginning of the season. It's like I could taste it. I could smell it. I could see the golden light at the end of the tunnel, which is game one. I mean, we're in the month, obviously, and we're only a few weeks away. So I'm getting pumped up. I'm getting excited. And today we are actually going to talk about a couple of different topics. So the overarching topic is pass game. And so we're going to look at that in a couple of different ways. We're going to look at that from an offensive standpoint, and we're going to look at historically and what we think they're going to be and all of that. And then defensively, the pass defense. Can they be as good as they've been, etc.? And so I'm looking forward to that. And then, of course, after that, since it is Thursday, I think we got off track a little bit before, but we are doing our final Power 4 conference preview, and that will be the Big 12. And it's not a spoiler alert, but this was by far the hardest conference to project, in my opinion. And I think
the one where we probably had the most
difference
of opinion.
Oh, yeah. Big time, especially at the top. So that one's going to be fun as well. So we're pass game, offense, defense, and then Big 12 overview, and that's the show for today. So stick around because we got a lot of good stuff coming your direction. So we are going to kick it off with the offensive side of the ball and the pass game. And so what does that mean exactly? That is, what we've seen recently in the pass game, and obviously there have been various trigger men over the last few years. Not a lot of continuity at the quarterback position. And a lot of that's because of the portal or injury or what have you. But, I think this is the fourth different starting quarterback in a row, right? 4 years in a row, different starting quarterback. Fifth, if you count, I guess, the last tenure of Ian Book. And so yet another quarterback goes under center. And, we are talking about the consistency of the pass game specifically in the big moments and when it matters most. And is there a chance that that is going to change going into this year, Brian?
Needs to.
Yes, it does.
I mean, that's the big thing, right? Like, will it change? I mean, we're going to find out, right? But the fact is it needs to, Vince. And that's the big thing is, like I'm sitting here, prepping for the show and I'm going over the data and I'm crunching numbers. And what it comes down to is last year was unique because last year was the first year that we actually saw the pass offense actually look really dangerous against bad teams
at times. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, and where you started to see okay, and this is kind of my comment about, when people talk about the receiving core and things along those lines. And it's like, look, I know they weren't as good as they needed to be, but the reality is it was still a group that when you break it down, it was still a group that when they played inferior opponents, they dominated.
Sure.
I mean, they weren't just good, but they dominated. But the same story that's been true for so long, Vince, was also true, which is, they didn't play well when it mattered. And when you look at the pass offense last year, there's some good things that we saw last year. 9.1 yards per attempt. That's pretty good. That's the best Notre Dame has had pass game wise in a very long time. Matter of fact, going back over the numbers, 9.1 last year was good. They were 8.0 the year before that, 8.1, 7.9, 7.9, 8.0, 6.6, 7.9, 8.8 back in 2015, 8.0, 7.7, 7.5, 6.9, 6.8, and then 8.7. Well, that 8.7, we had Jimmy Clausen, Michael Floyd, and Golden Tate. So the 9.1, you're like, boy, that's really good. And this is what makes last year's offense so difficult to discuss. Because on one side, you have a group of people that just only focus on the big games and act like Jared Parker sucked because of this, and the receiving core sucked because of this, and Sam Hartman sucked because they didn't play well in big games, and completely ignore what happened against the inferior teams. Now, you don't get paid at Notre Dame. Your legacy is not built around what you do against the inferior opponents. But when you're analyzing where they are based on where they need to go, you have to be willing to look at that. And when you look at last season and you look at what they did to the teams that were less than I mean, they ripped them up, Vince. I mean, they ripped Navy up. They ripped Tennessee State up. They ripped Central Michigan up through the air. They ripped up Pitt through the air. They ripped up Wake Forest through the air. They ripped up Oregon State on the air. They would have done that against Stanford if they needed to. But when you run for 350 yards and Audric Estime is a man possessed, you're like, we're good. Sam had a bad pick early, and they just didn't need to throw the football. So you have to be willing to look at that and say, hey, look, they definitely made progress because they had talented players. They had a 6-year senior at quarterback. You had a really good tight end. You had talented, fast receivers at certain spots, and your freshman class was pretty talented. But when you got into big games, this team was way different. And that's really what it boils down to, Vince, is will they get better? Look, I fully expect this offense to do exactly what it did last year, Vince, at the very minimum. And that is they're going to rip up the bad teams and struggle against the good teams. Like, that's the minimum of what we're going to see this year. Like, I fully expect the yards to be better, and there's a lot of I expect to be better just because the talents can be better. What we have to learn and what we have to find out, Vince, is can they be better in those big games? And my point is, well, I should say this. Let me rephrase the minimum, because I just made it seem like I predicted this is what it's going to be. Here's what I mean. Let me put it differently, because I think you know where I meant to go with that one. I could see it in your face. The minimum, this team is going to rip up the inferior opponents in the pass game. That's the minimum. The question then becomes, okay, what do they do in the big games? And for people that are still in the chat, but the big games are what matters. Okay, calm down. Listen for a second. Okay, like, we've said that. The big games are what you evaluate. But what you have to be willing to do is say, okay, as a whole, have they made progress? Are they better? And the answer is they took a step last year in some regards. And really, 2 of the last 3 years that they've had a veteran quarterback, they've actually had some really good moments throwing the football. They're not there yet because they don't play well in the big games, right? Everyone nobody acknowledges the big games aren't the problem. The thing you have to be willing to look about, however, is to say, okay, but are they still just the same pass offense they've always been, or are they maybe making strides in other areas, and now it's time to get to that next level? And that's going to be the question. Can they take that next level? Because you can't ignore, Vince, a couple things. You can't ignore how good they were last year throwing the ball at times. Last season, for example, Notre Dame averaged 285.1 yards per game. And if you break the schedule into 2 segments, there's what I believe are the 6 best teams in the schedule, which is NC State, Ohio State, Duke, Louisville, USC, and Clemson. Right? That's my 6. I took Oregon State out because the version of Oregon State that Notre Dame faced is not the top 25 team during the regular season. Okay?
Agreed.
And then the other 7 games are Navy, Tennessee State, Central Michigan, Pitt, Wake, Stanford, Oregon State. Notre Dame averaged 285.1 yards per game against those opponents that were not those teams, right? So when you look at the production over the course of the year, you say, well, you look at your top 6, your bottom 7 opponents. Notre Dame ripped them up pretty good. I mean, they did some serious damage against them, and the difference is when you look at this team, Vince, the difference last year and years before is that right there. I mean, you can't ignore that right there, that they were better. And here's an example. If you look at 2021, okay, and you look at how they did against the 7 bottom opponents on the schedule, they averaged 212.3 yards per game passing, right? 212.3. So clearly they were better last year than they were in past years. If you look at where they were in 2021 and you look at what they did against the opponents that were not, you consider the top opponents, and then Notre Dame averaged 314 yards passing per game that season. Actually, I don't know that I'm doing that math right. Let me just fact that real quick, because I don't know that that's correct. So just give me 1 second. So that's 6 games. They played 13 games. Yeah, because they had 509 yards in the bowl game. So let me just do this math without the crazy bowl game experience here real quick, Vince, and I'll give you what I'm referring to in the regular season. So in the regular season against their not their top 2 opponents, they were 282.2 yards per game, right? So we've seen in those moments that there was with Jack Cohn and Sam Hartman, way better production in those lesser half games. In 2022, they just couldn't throw the ball on anybody. I mean, that's just the reality of it. But here's the problem with 2021. I had to count Florida State as one of their top 6 opponents. That's how soft their schedule was, because it was at least a big moment, even though they ended up not being a good team. But if you look at the 5 teams that they played that year that actually like had good teams, and you look at what they were in the 5 big games where teams were actually good, they only averaged 220 yards per game per passing the ball. In 2022, against the 6 top teams on the schedule, they averaged 201 passing yards per game. And last year, against the top 6 teams in the schedule, they only averaged 201.5 yards per game. So even though they've been better against the lesser opponents with the veteran quarterbacks, nothing's changed. And in fact, if you go back and look at 2022, they actually had more passing yards per game against the best teams on the schedule than they did last year or the year before.
Really? That's actually
about
shocking.
11 yards. Yeah. Well, part of it's because they had 318 yards in the win over USC, because USC's defense was not good. And then one of those 6 best teams was North Carolina, who had a terrible defense. They passed for 289 yards.
True.
And then the other games I had were Ohio State, Marshall, Syracuse, and Clemson. But they threw for only 201 yards combined in wins over Syracuse and Clemson. That's just not going to get it done.
Right.
So the point is while I believe Notre Dame has raised the bar throwing the football, statistically, I expect that to continue thanks to the arrival of the talent that they have and Mike Denbrock. The question is going to remain, can they go out there against the best teams on the schedule and hurt them throwing the football? That's really what this conversation comes down to. And ultimately, that's going to determine how good this team can be. Are they a playoff team that maybe wins a home game? Sure. And then after that, you're kind of outclassed, or maybe you win 2 playoff games because you get a Big 12 team in the second round. You're just better than they are, and you win that one. Then you get to semifinals, and we're back to where we used to be, where you get ripped up by 3 touchdowns. That's really where Notre Dame is going to be, because they haven't been able to have those moments in big games. And Vince, that's been true for however long. I mean, you look at 2020. Right, last time Notre Dame had a really, really excellent team. They went into the postseason, passed for 19 yards against Clemson, 7.8 per attempt. That's terrible. They threw for 236 yards against Bama, only 5.6 yards per attempt, 0 passing touchdowns in those 2 games in the postseason. You look at 2018, they get to the postseason against Clemson, only passed for 160 yards, no touchdowns, 1 interception. So in your last 3 postseason games against an opponent that was on your level, Notre Dame has not thrown a single touchdown pass. Not one. Not one. And if you go back to, if you look at the biggest postseason games Notre Dame has played, would you agree that it's Bama in 2012, Ohio State in 2015, and LSU in 2017, Clemson in 2018, and then Clemson and Bama in 2020. So that's what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 postseason games. Is that accurate? Right? In those games, Vince, they've only thrown 5 touchdown passes.
Wow.
And if you go back and look at it, a couple of them were late. 2012, they had a late touchdown pass when they were getting killed by Bama. And then that LSU team they beat was good, but not great. People will point to Oklahoma State and Fiesta Bowl. I don't care about Oklahoma State and Fiesta Bowl. They didn't have their defensive coordinator. There was nothing on the line. It wasn't this game matters. All the games that I just pointed to, something was on the line. 2020 ACC championship, 2020 playoff game. And that's why you could even say 2017 LSU, you could even take that out of the mix, because, I mean, there wasn't any line.
Yeah.
But what was on the line was Brian Kelly's career.
That's true.
If after 2016, you come out, you get a lot of positive vibes, and then you completely go in the tank down the stretch. Because remember, at one point in time, Notre Dame in 2017 was 8-1 and ranked very high, and then they got killed by Miami, beat Navy barely, got spanked by Stanford. If they go out and lose to LSU and they lose 3 of their last 4, all the positive momentum from that previous season are gone. So it's even the number's even worse, Vince, if you take the LSU game out, which you probably should, and you look at the Ohio State game in 2015, which I thought was a huge moment for Notre Dame. You look at the Clemson bowl game or the Clemson title playoff game, the Bama playoff game, and then the Clemson ACC title game and the Bama game. You only have 5 games, 3 touchdown passes in those games. None of them were competitive. None of them were competitive. And if that doesn't change, Vince, then at the end of the day, when the season ends, it's going to be the same story for Notre Dame. The numbers are going to look better. The stats will, you know what I mean? The stats will be better for a host of reasons we'll get into. But at the end of the day, Vince, it's about, can you do it when it matters most?
Sure.
And that's where a lot of what we're going to talk about is focused on. When we talk about concerns and reasons to be optimistic and all those type of things, it's not about, well, can they throw the ball on Northern Illinois and Purdue and Miami of Ohio and Virginia, or honestly, even Texas A&M, although I would say that will tell us something because it is a big road game and all those type of reasons. But what are they going to do when it matters most? Can they throw the ball against Louisville this year? Can they throw the ball against Florida State this year? Can they throw the ball against USC this year? Can they throw the ball against A&M? And then when they get to the postseason, can they throw the ball then? Like, look, Notre Dame is absolutely a running football team. They're always going to be a team that is built around being able to run the football. Vince, I don't ever want that to change.
Right.
But to win a championship in the modern era,
you got to throw it.
You can't be 1988 Notre Dame.
Right.
You just can't. You're just not going to win that way.
It's not realistic.
Especially if you've got to win 4 games.
Right.
There may be games where in the playoff where you can go out there and say, hey, we're going to go out there and we're going to run the ball all over this 12 seed. Okay, cool. Maybe being able to do that in the second round against an ACC champ or Big 12 champ or a not that great Big 10 or SEC champ in one of those years where maybe that's the case. But once you get in the semifinals, you're right back to where you were in a 14 playoff.
Mm-hmm.
Now you're playing the cream of the crop. Can you throw the ball? Now you're playing teams will have equal talent that you have, or at least close. Maybe slightly more, maybe slightly less, but they're in the ballpark. That's where Notre Dame has had problems over the years. And that's where we're going to find out if this team can really take it to that next step. You know, and there's reasons to be optimistic.
Sure.
But they've got to prove it. And so what this show is going to focus on, Vince, when we talk about the offense is, okay, what are the reasons to be optimistic? What are the big concerns? Who are the key players involved in making it successful in those moments? Because with the talent they have at quarterback and receiver, I mean, I wrote an article today, Vince, about, you know, the receiving core and how the transfer class has been so instrumental in the optimism about that. Here's a number for you. If the transfer class doesn't show up, Notre Dame would be returning. This would be their returning production at receiver from last year. 61 catches, 942 yards, and 12 touchdowns. That's their returning production at receiver from last season. That's it. Right? Now you add the transfers in, 131 catches, 2,038 yards, and 10 touchdowns is what those guys had by themselves.
Okay.
Now you add them to the roster, and it's 192 catches, 2,980 yards, and 22 touchdowns last season. Not for their careers, last season. And you start to say, okay, there's no doubt Northern Illinois is in trouble. Miami of Ohio is in trouble.
Oh,
Purdue's
sure.
in trouble. Virginia's in trouble. Army's in trouble. Navy's in trouble. That's why I'm still like, dude, I don't care who the quarterback is. This is a 10-win team. Should be a 10-win team just because on talent alone. But again, your standard at Notre Dame isn't, can you go 10-2 every year?
Right.
Your standard is, can you compete for a championship? And so will the things we discuss be enough, or what the concerns are relative to how they perform in the biggest moments and what they do when they get to the postseason? That's going to be the question. And again, I'm not saying they're not going to. What I'm saying is that's the unknown. Right. We can be as optimistic as we want to be, but it's now show me mode. And these are the things that we think that are going to need to be done or can be done, or reasons why we think that this may be the year we do start to see that from this offense. And that's what kind of gets me a little fired up, Vince.
I don't know how it couldn't get you fired up. And, you know, we have grown accustomed to the past game dominating the inferior opponents. I mean, we have, right? I mean, we go into these games and we expect fireworks and we expect high scores and we expect points and we expect yards and all of those things. And that's one of the things that we actually give Brian Kelly a lot of credit for from when he was here, is that and I know we're talking past games specifically, but overall, they're beating the teams they should beat on a regular basis. And that wasn't always the case pre-2016. Post-2016, it really was, right? And that's not always an easy thing to do, right? I mean,
No,
this
it's
is
not.
still college football, and there's still, the any given Sunday kind of a deal with the NFL. I mean, it's a similar situation, but he made it so that they win those games.
And Brian Kelly deserves credit for that. Because
Absolutely.
they didn't do that, like you said, pre-2015.
Right.
There's plenty of games we could point to. You're like, how do you lose that game?
Exactly.
How do you lose to 4-8 Northwestern? How
Right.
do you lose to Tulsa? That's they're a decent team, but they're inferior to you. How do you lose to Navy by 18 points? You know what I mean? There were so many of those games you're just like, I don't know how you lose that game.
Right.
And one thing that Brian Kelly corrected a lot because of the hires he made, Matt Bayless and Mike Oko and Clark Lee and Chip Long and guys like that, with Matt Bayless being at the very top of that list, you got to give him credit for that. And Marcus Freeman learned in year one of his first year, those are not easy games to win. If you can't
look past them.
You're right, exactly. And that's why you lost to Marshall. That's why you lost to Stanford.
Right.
And so then, of course, in year two, you felt good that, okay, I think Coach Freeman's figured out that you've got to have a certain mindset for these moments.
Sure.
And last year, yes, Brian Kelly always won those games, but they weren't always the prettiest wins.
That's fair.
Right.
That's fair.
And the teams that were really bad, they would blow out. I mean, you look at 2019, they blew out New Mexico. They blew out Bowling Green. They weren't very good. They had to come back against Virginia. They struggled to beat a very mediocre USC team that year. They had to come back late and beat a mediocre Virginia Tech team that year. I mean, so there were some games, they had some blowout wins, but there was also some games where they struggled against teams that honestly just weren't that good.
Mm-hmm.
What Marcus Freeman's team did last year was they not only beat those teams, they obliterated those teams. I mean, they weren't even competitive football games. Like the Pitt game, Notre Dame played like trash in the first quarter of that game and won 58-7.
Right.
I mean, you have Sam Hartman throwing picks, and you got all these mistakes. He ended up throwing 2 picks that game, and they still beat them. I don't think the offense played great against Wake Forest. They still won 45-7. I mean, those are the things you look at, Vince, and say this team has shown. Like, look, we're like the big dogs now in that regard. Because like when Ohio State plays an inferior opponent, 99 times out of there's the occasional Purdue 2018. There's the occasional, you weren't locked in against the Maryland. You have to outscore them. But by and large, you go back and look at Ohio State over the years, when they're playing significantly inferior opponents, they blow them out.
Right.
Alabama blows those teams out. There's always Georgia 2019 gets upset at home by 4-8 South Carolina. Those games happen every now and then. But by and large, when Georgia's played an inferior opponent, they've blown them out. That's what the best teams do. That's progress.
Mm-hmm.
But those teams also beat the better teams. And most of Kirby Smart's losses, like in big games in his career, were to the same person, Nick Saban. You know what I mean? So those are things you look at and say, this team's got to show that. But you can't ignore the fact that they've figured out how to beat everybody else. And that's what kind of gives you a confidence that the baseline's at least going to be here as a team, as an offense. But we have to find out if they can do that next thing, and that's going to be something very interesting to see how it unfolds. And we're going to express some reasons why we actually think it's going to be a positive this year, but then also things that could maybe derail it.
Right. Before we get into that, make sure you hit the like button, the subscribe button, that notification bell, share it with your family and friends, and jump on the boards, boards.irishbreakdown.com. Intel's dropping every day, folks. So if you're not part of the boards, I don't know what to tell you. So you got to get over there. It's a great investment. If you're a true Notre Dame fan, great investment for you. So make sure you make that happen.